Okay, everybody, today I'm going to be talking to you about the Reformation, which is something that happened in regard to the medieval Catholic Church. So, as we've discussed in class, the Western European Christian Church was based in Roman doctrine, and we're familiar now with the medieval Catholic Church structure a little bit. So, Catholic, as I believe I've mentioned before, just meant universal, right? The idea was that everyone was part of the universal Christian Church, which they called the Catholic Church. And the Pope is at the head, and all of the hierarchy and the authority descends from there. Because the authority was centralized, that meant that there were a lot of opportunities for abuse or for corruption, and that was especially true the larger and larger the institution got, and it got pretty large. And Rome is not centrally located in Europe, and at the time they didn't have the kind of communication systems that we have now, so it was really hard to keep control of people in the outlying areas. So we saw in Unit 2 already a growing dissatisfaction with some of the abuses of the church and challenging some of the Catholic Church doctrine. And there were additional things that people were sort of frustrated with against this point. There were a number of grievances that people had. One of them is that the church was extraordinarily rich by now. They collected land, they had their own slaves and servants, they had richly appointed clothing, they had beautiful cathedrals with beautiful art and lots of gold. If you go visit any of the cathedrals in Europe, you'll see all of this wealth on display. And people would also will land to the church after they died, or like allow the church to inherit land after they died. And this particularly bothered a lot of members of the reigning aristocracy who didn't want to lose that land and didn't want it consolidated under the church. There were lots of different kinds of abuses of power, including things like the pardoner and the summoner from Chaucer. The summoner blackmails people to go into church court. The pardoner sells fake relics. And probably one of the most famous is the sale of papal indulgences. And indulgences, as you may recall, started off as being a way to reward people who had done really good things for the church, but then eventually became a way to sort of buy your way out of hell, a get out of hell free card, as it were. One of the folks who ended up being extraordinarily frustrated by some of these abuses was our friend Martin Luther. Martin Luther was a German priest and professor of theology at Wittenberg University, and he protested the sale of papal indulgences by posting a lecture, now known as the 95 Theses. He nailed these to the church door or the wall, and this was actually not so much a way of him sort of launching a formal protest, but he was posting the information about what he was going to be teaching that day in his course, which was a normal thing that you posted sort of the outline of the lecture that you were going to be giving. But because his lecture was a critique, it caught fire and it went everywhere. And all of a sudden it went essentially the equivalent of viral. It went early modern viral. And it was huge. And when the Pope heard about it, he reacted by threatening to excommunicate Luther. And that prompted Luther to burn the Pope's letter in response. So it started a little bit of a war, essentially. And Luther was excommunicated officially in 1521 when he refused to recant his beliefs. He argued he was beholden to the scripture and God and not to the Pope. So he was hunted by folks who resisted the Reformation, for example, the King of Spain. Over the next few decades, his ideas, along with the ideas of reformers like John Calvin or Ulrich Zwingli, they ended up sparking a reform movement that resulted in the Christian church splitting into those who adhered to the teachings of the Pope, so those would be Catholic Christians, and those who didn't adhere to the teaching of the Pope, so that would be Protestant Christians. I know sometimes you probably hear the term like, I'm not Catholic, I'm Christian, but that's actually a misunderstanding of church history, because ultimately Christian is the overarching umbrella, people who believe in Jesus Christ or who believe that Jesus was divine, right? That's part of what Christianity is about, hence the term Christ, right? Christianity. But Catholic Christianity is derived from this Roman version that predates Protestant Christianity, which derives from this time of the Reformation. So they were called Protestant because they protested. So today, denominations like Baptist or Methodist or Presbyterian, these represent the Protestant side. Episcopalian, Anglican, these are all Protestant Christian churches, whereas Roman Catholic retained those same traditions and didn't shift in the way that the Protestant churches did. All right, there were other Reformation leaders who were influential, such as John Calvin, as I mentioned, a French-Swiss reformer. But the Reformation caused massive political, international conflict. Nations, regions, individuals, they all had to decide where their loyalties lay. And violence was really, really common. And this map shows you a little bit of how different countries did or didn't respond to Protestantism and who they ended up aligning with. So, for example, if you see this yellow color here, you can see that that applies in Germany, where Luther was, as well as up here in the Scandinavian areas. So they tended to go a little bit Lutheran, right? The blue color that you can see here represents Calvin and areas of Calvinist influence. You can see Scotland, you can see some other areas that were influenced. So Calvin had influence in France, you can see here, but you can also notice that it's not the whole country that's colored blue, because France, like many countries, didn't entirely stick with one thing. It wasn't that all of France went Catholic or all of France went Protestant, but there was division. So, for example, there was a public protest by the Protestants, or what were called Huguenots in France, and the previously tolerant king began persecuting the Protestants in France, and Calvin ended up fleeing the country. Eventually, the division led to the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 50 to 100,000 Huguenots in France. So this cycle of violence lasted throughout the next sort of few decades, and it ends up lasting through the mid-17th century when in 1648 the Peace of Westphalia finally allows individual rulers to choose and provides protection, or at least a certain amount of protection, for people to choose their own religious preferences, so a small amount of like religious freedom, I guess. And you'll also notice here that, some folks stayed obviously with Catholicism, such as Spain, and obviously Italy, right? And then you'll notice this little green funky color up here, which is Anglicanism, and that's what happens in England and the parts of Ireland that are occupied by England. And that's what I'm going to tell you about in the next few slides. In England, the situation had its own little unique twists, just like everywhere else. And in particular, that twist had to do with this fella right here. You know him, you love him. He's Henry VIII, Henry Tudor. Da, 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 da. So the War of the Roses, which was a 15th century civil war to determine the rulers of England, the Lancasters versus the Yorks. And if those names sound a little bit familiar, it's because the War of the Roses is part of the inspiration for Game of Thrones with the Lannisters and the Starks. So just a little tidbit there for any of you GOT fans. That war came to an end with the succession of Henry Tudor, or Henry VII, father of the famous Henry VIII, who is the one that we're looking at right now. This is Mr. Henry VIII. And if you watch The Tudors, it's about Henry VIII. So it's a good show. You should check it out. Henry VIII came to the throne at 18, and he was a very strong English ruler, and as you can see, he ruled for quite some time. And his rule is associated with England entering the Reformation. So at first, Henry resists. He's not interested. He was a staunch supporter of the Pope, so much that the Pope actually called him a defender of the faith, because Henry wrote a treatise called The Defense of the Seven Sacraments. So Henry was having none of it. He was like, nope, I'm a good Catholic. But this all changed when Henry's desire to have a male heir was thwarted because his first wife had the, audacity to have a daughter rather than a son. So he tried to get his marriage annulled, which is similar to a divorce, but it was denied that. I mean, it was divorce wasn't an option at that point. So because of that, he decided that that essentially the fact that he was not able to have his marriage annulled meant that he changed his mind about the Catholic Church, and he decided, all right, fine, we're going to reform in England in many ways so that he could put aside his first wife and marry another woman. A moment here to stop and talk about Henry's wives. He's the one, if you're like, I'm Henry VIII, I am, right? That's him. So his first wife is Catherine. And she's Spanish. She's from Aragon, which is an area in Spain. And I always have to remember not to say Aragorn from Lord of the Rings when I say that. And she gives birth to Mary, who will later become Queen of England. But Catherine then ends up being divorced through what Henry ends up doing, which I'll tell you about in just a second after I tell you his scandalous wife stories. So he divorces Catherine, and then he marries this little hottie over here, Anne Boleyn, who she's the one who gives birth to Queen Elizabeth, Elizabeth of Queen Elizabeth fame, Elizabeth I. But Anne also didn't have any sons. She also had a daughter, which Henry did not like. And Henry accused Anne of adultery with at least 5 men and subsequently beheads her for these alleged acts of treason. She may or may not have done it. We don't know. Either way, Henry decided that she had, and whether he knew it, most people think he fabricated those as a way to get rid of her because he didn't have an excuse to divorce her in the way that he did with Catherine, because there was some drama there with Catherine that allowed him to get away with that. He didn't have that option with Anne, so he beheads her. Here's the problem with marrying a king. All right, so to continue, the rest of his wives, Jane Seymour is the third wife, and she finally gives Henry what he wants, which is a son. And this is Jane. Many people think that Jane was sort of Henry's love of his life in a sense, and maybe it's just because he finally got his son, but she died shortly after childbirth. And then Henry married again Anne of Cleves, and his marriage to her was annulled soon after, and then he married Catherine Howard. Catherine also had an affair, just like Anne, and he beheaded her. And then he married another Catherine, and that's his 6th and last wife, and she outlives him finally. So if you want to remember the story of Henry's wives, it goes like this. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. Yeah, that tells you the story of his wives. Oh, goodness, Henry. Because Henry wanted a divorce, he decided that England needed to leave the Catholic Church and break out on its own. And he enacts a number of different measures that consolidate his control of his newly created English church. So in 1530, he makes the clergy recognize his power as the head of the English church instead of the Pope. And he forces them all to do that under pain of death, essentially. In 1533, you can see that he creates the Act of Succession, making all adult men swear to support his new marriage. And then the next year, he passes the Act of Supremacy, which in effect is what actually jettisons England from the Catholic Church, because Parliament then becomes involved and they pass this act, and it officially splits them from the Catholic Church and names Henry the head of the church in England, which is then called the Anglican Church, because, the Angles. So it's the Anglican Church, which is the Church of England. And the king is the head of the Church of England instead of the Pope. This caused a ton of turmoil, and the Pope promptly excommunicated Henry as well. And a lot of this turmoil, then the sort of division between the Protestants and the Catholics is still going on, or had been until very recently, in Ireland. This division, especially exacerbated by sort of British colonial expansion in Ireland throughout the Renaissance time. So there's a lot going on. After this series of laws, Henry takes the drastic step of dissolving the monasteries, all of them, 2 years later, and he takes all of their wealth, which was substantial, for himself. And this is a way that he could simultaneously enrich himself and strike a huge blow to the church, solidifying his power over them. So for the next decade or so in England, there's going to be a lot of religious turmoil as the country switches back and forth between Protestantism and Catholicism. So when Henry dies, Edward, his son, takes over. Edward is only 10 years old when he becomes king, so his advisors are really ruling the country. And this means that the country stays Protestant. It retains the sort of Church of England setup that Henry gave it. Nothing alters because Edward's not old enough. He's also a very sickly young boy, and he dies 6 years after taking the throne at age 16. So after that, then, Mary, Henry's first daughter, takes over. Mary was fiercely Catholic because, as you may remember, her mother was from Spain, and Spain retained Catholicism in the sort of Reformation turmoil, essentially. And Mary was also married to a Spanish husband, and she was fiercely Catholic. So There was a rebellion, Wyatt's Rebellion, which develops during her reign in 1554 in response to this extreme return to Catholicism, and she imprisons many of the folks involved with that, including the future Elizabeth I. She continues to burn and punish those who didn't switch back to Catholicism until she dies in 1558. So this is why she was called Bloody Mary, or why she's referred to as Bloody Mary, because she came in and required everyone to switch back to Catholicism and enforced that law militarily through physical violence and through incarceration. So when she dies, though, then Henry's his second child, the third child of his to become monarch, his second child, Elizabeth, takes over, and she rules for the next 50 years. As you can see, or 51 technically, but she rules for a long, long time. She was called the Great Compromiser because she works out essentially an uneasy peace, settling the country back into Protestantism, but with a Catholic flavor. So the Anglican Church retains a lot of the things that are associated with Catholicism, even though theologically it has beliefs that are associated with Reformation and Protestantism. So that's the sort of situation with England over the next few decade or so, as I said, until Elizabeth comes and sort of restores the country back to this thing that her father had developed.